this lecture will look at causal processes that are called necessary conditions and sufficient conditions. And these are causal processes that are common to use in small n research. So let's compare the kinds of causal relationships that we talk about when we do large N studies versus when we do small N studies. So large N studies, large N research is what we've basically been talking about all throughout the course so far. And the causal relationships that we look at with these large N studies are ones where you have what are called a contributory cause. This is where you have your x, your independent variable, and that increases the likelihood of your dependent variable occurring. So this is something where you have an increase in x leading to an increase in y, or an increase in x leading to a decrease in y. It's a relationship that's bit by bit that you can imagine plotting it on a scatter plot. So for example, the example we talked about of having an increase in racial diversity in a community leading to a reduction in social spending, right? So the more people who are of different racial and ethnic backgrounds you have, the less spending you have on social programs. So that's the kind of relationship that we've been talking about all throughout the class so far. But there are other kinds of causal relationships that we look at that are really good at being covered by small n studies. So with small n research, we do look at contributory causes. So that is something that's covered by both large N and small n research. But we also look at what are called necessary and sufficient conditions. So what are necessary conditions and what are sufficient conditions? First, necessary conditions. A necessary condition is one in which x must be present for y to occur. So your independent variable has to be there in order to ever see y. So the example here is from Barrington Moore's book, The Social Origins of Democracy and Dictatorship. And he argues that if you don't have a strong middle class, you can't have democracy. In other words, no middle class, no democracy is the saying from his book. So we have two photos here. On the left-hand side, we have a photo of the French Revolution. On the right-hand side, we have a photo of Nazi Germany. The French Revolution changed the economic bases of the country and redistributed wealth, redistributed land in order to have a solid middle class develop. So when democracy came on in France in the 1800s, that meant that there was a middle class base that politicians were clamoring for their votes, which led to a more centrist form of democracy, and democracy became fairly stable, right? On the right-hand side, we have this photo of Germany. And in Germany, they never had that kind of major land redistribution, wealth redistribution that we saw with the French Revolution. As a result, when democracy came on, it was still very divided, the country. You had much more inequality, much more people who were wealthy versus people who were poor, and you were missing that middle class anchor for democracy. As a result, in the 20th century, we saw this kind of fascist movements like with Nazism that led to mobilization of people. You didn't have that middle class that was moderating and anchoring democracy. So here, this is a necessary condition to have this middle class. It's not a question of having a little bit more middle class leads to a little bit more democracy. Unless you have this core middle class, democracy will be impossible. A sufficient condition is one that whenever x is present, y will occur, right? So here the example would be that having the degree of anti-Semitism that we saw in Germany in the early 1900s to the mid-1900s was sufficient for genocide of Jews in Germany. That the degree of that hatred towards Jews was so high that it didn't matter if Hitler was in charge or if somebody else had been in charge, that no matter what, you're going to have some degree of genocide that was going to happen there. So unlike a necessary condition where you'd say, well, maybe anti-Semitism is required for genocide, here you're saying that the level of anti-Semitism was so high that it pushed you over the bar, that no matter what else was going on, it was going to be sufficient for your outcome to occur. And you can have conditions that are both necessary and sufficient. And these are fairly rare in political science, but it's important to remember that they're possible. So a cause that's both necessary and sufficient means that X leads to Y and that X is required for Y to occur. So as an example here, you can think of Ebola. Ebola in West Africa, that's what this photo is from. And here, having a transfer of fluids from somebody who's exhibiting Ebola symptoms will lead to a transfer of the Ebola virus. So having this transfer of fluids is necessary for somebody to contract Ebola. You can't get Ebola just from being around somebody who coughed. You have to have an actual transfer of fluids for it to happen. But also, if you have a transfer of fluids from somebody who has Ebola symptoms, you will get Ebola. There's no way around it. That is always going to be enough to push you over to get the Ebola virus. You may not die, but you will contract Ebola. So this is a condition that is both necessary and sufficient for the outcome to occur.